Seek, above all, for a game worth playing. Oh baby, it's witchcraft contagious. I felt it for ages. We're out of these cages in this house of mages. It's witchcraft, it's dangerous. Beware of these pages. There's spells of all flavors in this house of mages. In this house of mages. In this house of mages.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Make Yoga Magick Again, the House of Mages podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Erulian Cuming. I am a mischievous mage, a lover of wisdom, a seeker of mysteries, and a ritual embodiment tantric yoga teacher trainer, amongst a mix of many other weird and wonderful things. In this episode, I chat with amorous artist and multiversal magician Jake Kobrin. Jake considers himself an interdimensional midwife and conduit, believing that the role of the artist is to move outside of themselves and to act as a conduit for higher consciousness to move through them. The work of Jake Kobrin is psychedelic, unusual, dark, beautiful, and elegant. His work seeks to illuminate experiences which Jake has had that are outside of the realm of normal waking consciousness, moving into numinous and visionary realms with natural ease. His work explores the interplay of shadow and light, both in the delicate modeling of the forms of his pictures, but also in the character of the subjects he portrays. His work showing a willingness to embrace all aspects of emotion, from revelation and peace to fear and disharmony. I only heard of Jake a few weeks ago when he was presented as a guest speaker for an esoteric group I follow and consider to be high caliber mages in general. When I saw Jake would be speaking about Grimoire magic, having a massive passion and background in it myself, I was curious to see his take on things. After reading a few of his posts, instantly resonating with his mischievous approach to spirituality, his willingness to explore the often skipped over corners of the occult, and eloquent ability to push people's buttons with a gentle, lighthearted grace, I knew I wanted to chat with him. Coincidentally, this chat lined up right after the end of his Saturn return, along with a few other synchronistic pieces that eventuated in an epic conversation, which you definitely want to make sure you listen to all the way to the end of. So without further ado, here's my chat about the art of magic and the magic of art with multi-dimensional mage Jake Kobrin. So this was a pretty spontaneous catch-up, as some of these are, but today I'm chatting with Jake Kobrin, and I've actually never chatted with him, and up to a week ago I hadn't even heard of what he does, but I saw he was coming on as a guest presenter for Dane Thomas's Esoteric Entrepreneur, and yeah, just something about, I don't know, the way you were presented or something intrigued me. And I went and had a look at your Instagram. And man, I feel like just what you were talking about and the way you were presenting yourself was just a breath of fresh air in like a very, at least in my circles, a lot of very like kind of light fluffiness in the spiritual way, like in the neo-tantric, neo-shamanic kind of space. And the fact that you were talking about evocation, the fact that you were, I don't know, kind of like playing with the dark, not like dark fluff, but playing with like the darker kind of aspects of stuff. And yeah, it just seemed like you had a sense of humor and you were messing with people a little bit. So yeah, I just thought you'd be a really interesting human to have a chat with. So welcome,
cool.
brother. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
So the first thing I wanted to ask is that you were talking about a concept called Black Tantra.
Mm-hmm.
And you were starting to, well, I don't know how far you are in it, if you're already started it or you're starting to put it together, a course that you were doing. And yeah, you mentioned a few things in it that intrigued me. One, that you're talking about evocation, which, you know, if anyone knows my history of magic, that's how I started with evocation and kind of grimoire-based magic. And also that the feedback you seem to be getting from people on it was that it was freaking people out a little bit. But I love that you kind of had a sense of humor about it. You're like, guys, I'm just like pushing the marketing here, and I'm just, so I'd love to talk about, how you got into magic, how you got into entrepreneurship. You're an artist as well, I see. And like how you can navigate a world that is often still very much in like a Christian Catholic mindset when it comes to the darker side of these kind of paths. So a lot of different questions in one, but.
Well, I think that people project a lot of fear onto things that they don't totally understand or have a lot of firsthand experience with, and that the solution to dissolving any fear when it comes to anything is just to kind of go into it and actually see what's there. So having done some forms of evocatory magic myself and worked a bit with grimoires and things that people tend to consider more the dark side of spirituality or the dark side of magic, and having had nothing bad happen as a result of that, and there being no like negative consequences that I've personally experienced from that, it's made me realize that a lot of the fear that surrounds these practices comes out of superstition and isn't really founded on anything. Not to say that in certain cases it couldn't be dangerous or to certain people, but at least in my experience, there wasn't anything that was particularly to be afraid of. So I like to just kind of put stuff out there that I think is going to provoke some of those fears, because it's a way of just showing people what needs to be looked at, like where there's light to be shown onto certain dark places that exist in people's psyche. And I'm pretty fortunate. I didn't grow up in a religious household. My parents were pretty agnostic. And I think that the fact that I didn't have really religious conditioning is what has allowed me to look at this stuff and not be freaked out by it. Because one thing that I hold pretty close to my heart is I don't really look at my subjective experiences that I've had through my explorations into magic and spirituality and shamanism and all these different things as being objectively real. I've had really powerful experiences, but I think that it's all within the play of perception. And I can't necessarily ascribe too much objective truth to anything that I've experienced, whether that's like something results oriented with magic, or those are encounters with beings, or whatever these kinds of strange experiences that I've had. I can't really say that those are necessarily real. I can just say that subjectively, I've had those experiences, so I'm not trying to carve myself deeper into some kind of reality tunnel. I'm trying to use these experiences as a way to liberate myself from any assumptions of reality, and I think that people get into trouble when they start to really, invest too much reality into these things, and then also to consider themselves experts based on other people's subjective experiences. Like if people have a subjective experience of performing some kind of magic and something bad happening from that, cool, that's like their subjective experience. That's data for them to draw upon in their own personal practice. But to then insist that that's the way for everybody is not helpful, because I believe in the relativity of each person's experience, of each person's neurology, of each person's practice, and that people need to explore things for themselves, discover what does and doesn't work for them, or has value for them, or meaning for them, and what doesn't, to like discard that. But I don't want to be too like, people I guess want a rule book or something, but magic, if it's good magic, will take you places that no one's ever been before, where you're like out in the unknown and there's no rule book for that, and you have to figure it out yourself through your own direct experience and whatever. But people want to be told like, oh, just do it like this and this will happen, but it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah, because it is more like, was my understanding, like there's a science too. There's certain processes that you can do that work, but it's essentially it's an art. And with art, you can't just add the pieces together and expect to come up with the same thing, because I feel like human consciousness is such a variable that even if you're doing the exact same thing step by step, like we're always in a different state of being, in a different state of operating. And there's a few things that you said I want to touch on, because I think a lot of people don't actually ask what we mean or what each other mean when we say certain words, like the word real. Like what does real mean? And even the word bad, right? Because for instance, when I first got into magic, I had someone give me a few books, and he said he worked with Evocation, and he said he practiced it and his whole life fell apart. He's lost his partner, he lost his job and all that sort of stuff, and told me like, stay away from it. He's like, here are the books, but I would definitely stay away from it because I tried it and everything went bad. So that kind of like prompted me to look into it even more, because I was like, oh, I'm really interested in this. But what I've found over time is that magic, it's interesting that people think of magic as like a hack to make your life easier. But in my experience, like magic is just all about like making yourself uncomfortable to grow. And I think looking back at that now, maybe the magic was starting to work by removing things out of his life.
Yeah.
But he didn't go to the next step. He just saw it as like, oh, it's just like tower card moment, right? Like clearing out the old, but didn't keep moving forward. And so, yeah, do you notice that in your own life and other people's, where using magic, often you need to create space first for other things to come in, and people's tendency to focus on the negative and label it as bad and evil? Do you find that?
Sure. I mean, I've like consciously worked with archetypes like Kali to upend and destroy and remove things in my life. But I think that'll happen in life, whether you're doing magic or any spiritual practice or not. I think that's just part of what life is. You know, almost every tradition or religion has this concept of the three-part God or the three-headed God, which is essentially the force of creation, which would be Isis, the force of generally it's either maintenance, in some cases it's also destruction. So that maintaining force or destructive force, which is Apophis, and then rebirth or the regeneration, which is Osiris. So that's the process that every thing goes through, right? We see those cycles in nature, but they occur also within our own life. And so, yeah, things die. That's uncomfortable. It's not always pleasant. But things also are reborn. You know, in that process of birth, maintenance, death, and rebirth, that's the cycle of life. You know, and that happens whether you're doing magic or not. And I think that people oftentimes just don't accept that is life. You know, that death is a part of life. We're going to lose everything. Like, that's the truth. You know, no matter what you know, your idea of success is, even if you achieve that ultimate success, you're going to lose everything. Like, you're going to die. Everything in your life is going to fade away at some point. And that has nothing to do with magic necessarily. So this dovetails back into what I was saying before, where it's dangerous sometimes to ascribe too much of, or to project too much of your story of this all being related to some kind of magical process, or, you know, in a way that's a strange ego trip in which you're perhaps ascribing too much power to yourself. You know what I mean? Like, to say, oh, I did this ritual and now everything in my life is falling apart. There's probably untold numbers of factors, you know, why that relationship ended. Yeah. You know what I mean? I mean, I can speak from personal experience. I definitely had a relationship like end and fall apart while I was doing a lot of magic, and it could have been part of it. But, you know, there's a lot of other factors that contributed to the end of that relationship. And I don't necessarily consider that to be a bad thing, because the amount of personal growth that I've undergone, you know, as a result of that relationship ending has been tremendous. I think we're both better off from not having for not being in that relationship now. It was kind of like, in a way, stagnant of our personal growth because we were too comfortable. So, you know, it's all a matter of perspective, how you frame events and circumstances. Having the idea that something is bad, anything that in your life is bad, is merely a story, a belief system that you're projecting onto something that is inherently neutral. So I try to frame things in a positive way because I find that my assumptions and stories that I tell myself about what is going on in my life seems to actually have a big impact on not only how I feel about any circumstance, but also what happens and the actions that I take, and ultimately what comes out of those circumstances. You know, you like have Holocaust survivors that say that being in internment camps was like the best thing that ever happened to them. You know, not like they're like, oh, I would gladly do that again. But people came out of that experience saying that it deepened their appreciation, their self-respect, their self-esteem. You know, a lot of positive things happen for people, a lot of positive growth and an understanding of their strength. And their feeling of like, it was empowering for some people to go through that. You know, not like anybody would volunteer for that, but there have been atrocities that people have experienced in their life that people consider to have been positive experiences.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's all, like you were saying, it's all about how you frame it and what you consider good and bad. Because, yeah, as you know, not to belittle anyone who's gone through traumatic events or things that have hindered them, but yeah, it is how you make it. And it is, you know, you can see certain people that attach themselves to the reasons why they can't do things or don't want to do things. And then people that no matter how much adversity they meet, they're able to overcome that and see the benefits of it. And yeah, so I'm interested, like, in the path of magic. Okay, so there's a few questions I want to ask. I'm just trying to figure out like the right route to go about it. But also why I was interested in chatting to you, because you have both experience in what looks like classical Tantra as well as ceremonial magic and things like that. And yeah, there seemed like a little bit of a divide or a misunderstanding about both of these paths, because, you know, you'd probably know that a lot of the modern New Age spiritual movement comes from, like, you know, kind of not the greatest translations from Blavatsky and all that sort of stuff moving into that. And a lot of people in New Age movement don't even know like who Blavatsky is or the Theosophical Society or any of that sort of stuff and how it relates to yoga. But I'd like to get your perspective, because to me, like, from delving into both of these paths, Tantra and yoga in general kind of feels like unraveling the layers and kind of stripping back all this conditioning that and framework that we've kind of accumulated over time since birth. But then magic seems like purposefully and consciously reframing things, and learning how to operate in those kind of frameworks. And especially if you can do it like chaos magic, for example, the ability to shift frameworks. But yeah, do you see it in a similar way? And how would you, I guess, explain the difference of like yoga and Tantra to the path of magic, and even, you know, the difference in just living life and in a non-magical way, if there is such a thing? And what is the path of magic and Tantra and all that from your perspective?
Okay. Yeah, I think that semantically we need to break a few things down. So you have classical Tantra. So classical Tantra would be like, ancient Indian occultism. And that's a very different thing than Neo-Tantra, right? Whereas the classical Tantra was a vehicle for people to achieve enlightenment ultimately. Neo-Tantra has a lot more to do with sexuality and increasing one's sexual pleasure and stuff like that. And that's not what classical Tantra was about at all. But people use the same word to describe both things, even though they're very different. And then when it comes to magic, you also have a variety of different things. So there is no continuous tradition of Western magic. And that's just given the fact that due to the Church Inquisition, due to, the burning of the Library of Alexandria, due to a lot of lost artifacts and things needing to go underground, whatever, there just isn't, so we have a lot of different things that are considered magic that have different intentions or different, they're vehicles with different purposes. So you have like the Grimoire tradition, and the Grimoire tradition is mostly about, affecting specific change to gain certain results, mostly through the use of evocation. Then you have high magic, which is a bit later on. That's the Order of the Golden Dawn and everything that came after that, which is pretty much what people think of when they think of when they think of magic nowadays. And that's not really about affecting. It's not results oriented really at all. It's more about a system of enlightenment as well. Some may call it the yoga of the West. And then you have chaos magic, which is kind of a completely stripped down version of the old grimoiric forms of magic, which is also results oriented. It's mostly about like achieving some kind of change in your reality. So these are all very different things. I think that just because something is old doesn't mean it's necessarily more value to somebody in our day and age than than something being a newer kind of version of it. Like I would probably prefer to drive in a car if I'm going somewhere than a horse-drawn carriage.
Yeah,
What I mean?
Yeah. And I feel like, because, you're in the kind of entrepreneurship, spiritual business world as well. And you've probably seen like, there's a tendency to try to validate what people are doing by calling it ancient knowledge. And especially like what I see most of is UPG based ancient knowledge where,
right.
Yeah, it's like there's no historical evidence of these kind of things ever existing, but through just saying that it was a download and through the UPG, like there's not really much people can say. But I think the biggest thing is, like you said, it doesn't really matter if something's old. Anything good should be constantly improved upon. And yeah, and so like, do you find that as well, that people are trying to justify what they're doing by labeling it or marketing it as like an ancient download, and why people feel the need to do that?
Well, yeah, I think most people who are teaching forms of spirituality, especially magic, like to try to make their version of it seem more legitimate by tying it to some kind of tradition. But even the Golden Dawn tradition of magic, which I think has tremendous value, and everything that's come after that, was largely constructed by a small group of individuals based primarily on their unverified personal gnosis. Same with Crowley, same with all of basically almost everybody that has become sort of famous as the primary source of Western magic. It's mostly unverified personal gnosis. So I think anybody's personal experience is as valuable as any of theirs. Not that I haven't been inspired and also educated by those sources, but it doesn't make them intrinsically more valuable than anybody else and what they're sharing. I will say, just on the subject of the relationship with Tantra and magic, that classical Tantra and high magic, like Golden Dawn style magic, are incredibly similar, like almost exactly the same. And so in a certain way, I think that when those systems of Western magic were being developed, they probably took heavy, influence from those Eastern traditions.
Yeah.
They incorporated some of the practices like the tattvas and things like that into it.
And even like working with chakras and the middle pillar ritual, like they're pretty much identical kinds of ideas as well.
Yeah, and also evocation is a part of classical Tantra as well.
Yeah.
And I think that it's possible that there's a shared origin, like maybe both of those forms of spiritual practice originate in ancient Egypt or something like that at one point broke off into different strains, and some of it went to Europe and some of it went to India, and that's why there's similarities. But it could also be that when the Order of the Golden Dawn and these other systems were being developed, they had maybe access to some of the Eastern Tantra material and they were utilizing it as influence for their system, one or the other.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like you said, where, with the kind of Indo-European magical systems and like spiritual history, a lot of that kind of got wiped out with, like the Christianization and, Catholicism and stuff like that. And it's almost like we have to take pieces from other cultures to be able to piece it all together. And I do feel like the tantric stuff like fits very naturally, but that's why I'm really focused on as much as I can pure classical tantra for the last couple of years, because it's a cohesive full system. And so I'm seeing like how a cohesive system can work, and then coming back to the magical stuff and, the Western occultism, and then seeing how my experience in Tantra can shape my experience in that. I'd love to come back to the your own experiences with it and the word real. So like, what I mean by that is my first experiences with Evocation, I was, it did freak me out. I was still very, I didn't grow up religious, but I still kind of had that conditioning around it, like summoning a demon or, goetic spirit, probably not going to be the safest experience or something, right? So these things seemed very objectively real to me at the time. But then as time went on, I was convinced more and more that these are just aspects or projections of my own psyche. And that was kind of depressing to a certain extent, because at one point I flipped over the other side of the pendulum and I'm like, it works, but it's all in my head. But now I've kind of got a bit more of a balanced approach between the two. And to be honest, I don't know, and I'm not sure. So I'd love to chat to you about your experiences of it. How would you perceive these experiences and how it connects into reality and all that sort of stuff?
I'm not saying it's not real in the sense that you and I are both real in a sense, and also in a sense, you're also largely defined by my perception. Like you only exist within my perception, and the information that I construct, the stories that I tell myself about what's happening exists solely within my perception. So it's not to say that there aren't spirits, that there aren't entities, that there aren't deities. I mean, there obviously are, in the sense that, I live in Bali. You can go walk around. There's Ganeshas everywhere. Like, Ganesha is a real thing, at least as a symbol. And I like this quote from Lon Milo Duquette. He says, "It's all in your head, but you don't realize how big your head is." It's not to say that if you don't perform, so if you perform a ritual correctly, you may ascertain an experience that is very convincingly real, in the sense that you will perceive the existence of a tangible entity that you can interact with, that you can work with. But I just mean that there's such a huge mystery as to how anything works and how whatever is happening, that any story that we can project onto an experience that we can have, especially when it comes to these very expanded states of awareness that we're talking about within magic or tantra or shamanism or any of these things, it's largely a projection. It's all a story that is reducing the infinite, reducing the mystery into something that's like we can kind of wrap our heads around. And anytime you do that, there's large distortion of what it actually is. You're not able to actually directly interface with the truth of it, because you've pinned it down into some kind of story, that is ultimately just a projection of our consciousness and our mind's ability to try to navigate through reality. So it's not to say that, like, I wouldn't be teaching about this stuff. I wouldn't be talking about this stuff if I didn't have experiences with magic that were very persuasive to me in terms of how effective magic is, in terms of doing certain rituals that produced results that were directly what I was aiming at, in very synchronistic and very unordinary ways. But I'm not going to invest so deeply into that reality because I don't necessarily know. You know what I mean? And whether you see, let's say, an entity or a being, whether you see that as a spiritual creature that you are interacting with, or you see that as an aspect of your psyche, those are both just perspectives. Neither are the truth. Those are just both like maps that you're projecting onto reality so that you can better navigate, or that you can try to make sense of your experience. Ultimately, who the fuck knows?
Exactly.
And so I think that when it comes to this stuff, there's just a huge amount that is largely incomprehensible, and it's not necessarily helping to try to get really theoretical and heady about what's going on. And does it work? Is it valuable? Is it helpful for you? And that also can be a lot of different things. It's not necessarily just because you got what you wanted that's valuable. It could be also an exploration of the shadow. A lot of within Indian spirituality, within certain kinds of magic, there's this emphasis on finding divinity in that which is disgusting or that which is repulsive. So I mean, that's part of, for me, it's like seeing the inherent divinity in everything, that there's literally nothing that is not sacred because there's only one thing, and that one thing is God. There's no there's God and there's not God. It's like, it is existence. It's the everything.
And that's what I'm really trying to encourage is people to see more things non-dualistically, and that's kind of like the lineage of like Tantra that I follow, non-dual Shiva Tantra. And the idea that, and I like the consciousness only model as well, because I feel like I'm always, I guess, looking for models that can encompass other systems as well. So like what you were talking about, that everything's filtered through our own perception and it's the stories around it. So seeing everything as consciousness can basically make everything real. And the idea of whether it's in our imagination or objectively real, it's just these labels we have to define our experiences. And it's kind of trying to figure out like, what can we actually measure? And, if we do a ritual, if we do an evocation, if I do the thing, then I change, and as well as like the world around me changes. So that's might be measurable, but what is actually happening, we're not really sure. And that'll be different depending on you, if I ask me or you and any of that sort of stuff. So, I know what you mean. If that's,
there's also like hundreds of years of tradition in which people have been theorizing and debating how magic works. And there's no consensus on that. There's people that are like, it doesn't work. It's bullshit. Cool. Great. That's their perspective. There's also people that are like, it's all just mind tricks. It's all placebo. It's all just psychology, Great. There's like the kind of bicameral mind theory in which it's just different aspects of your brain that are forming neural pathways to each other that didn't previously exist, that can be ascertained or perceived as separate entities. Like you're talking to another part of your own brain. Then there's the spirit-based model. It's like, it's literally a spiritual creature that you're interacting with. And then whatever, it's all the Leela, it's all the play of consciousness. It's all, there are all these different perspectives, but at the end of the day, they're just stories. And it's not about that for me. Being in spiritual communities, I see how people have a lot of different kinds of mystical experiences or psychedelic experiences or experiences with ayahuasca that don't always seem to benefit people in a practical way. And so for me, I'm more concerned with having my value system clear and straight, and then weighing things against that value system if anything is taking me closer to where I want to be in life or not. And to see people sabotage professional or business opportunities or whatever as the result of certain mystical experiences that they have, to be flaky and unreliable, to make excuses, or to have stories as to why they can't perform based on their word due to some kind of ayahuasca experience or something. To me, that is not helpful. That's not beneficial. And I see that a lot in spiritual communities. So I'm just careful to try to stay as centered, balanced, and grounded in kind of my present moment experience, and try to actually be out of my head as much as I can be, than to let myself get like all paranoid and swept away by any kind of experience that I have. And this is I think this is really important as just kind of like harm reduction. If you're going to be engaging in any of this stuff, if you're going to be doing psychedelics, if you're going to be working with ritual and magic, especially when it comes to working with these kinds of things like evocation or sex magic or, Tantra. I mean, these are like really high octane stuff. These are like extremely consciousness altering practices. And if you're going to be a psychonaut, if you're going to be going into these high octane consciousness altering practices, you need to have a foundation.
Yeah, you need to prepare your vessel. You don't just go into space without a solid spaceship and a spacesuit, right? Like, I feel like people are, really just trying to jump into the fireworks and they want to have the like ecstatic experience, but their vessel isn't prepared. And I think that's why I really try to encourage people to do yoga and actual yoga with unpacking and seeing how everything works and seeing what belief systems and conditioning we have. Because you've probably seen the same thing. Like you were saying, people have these plant medicine journeys, or even just, in a neo-tantric kind of sacred sexuality container, they might have a big, experience, but their nervous system gets overloaded. And then so they just revert back to their default, belief in whatever. And if they have something, that's where I hear a lot of the spiritual community, I've got bad entities attached to me now just from going into a container and all this sort of stuff. But they haven't delved into what actually, because people think that they're not religious. People say, I'm agnostic or, even atheist. And, there might be to a certain extent, but when they go into a traumatic situation, I feel like the body reverts to that, almost like that childlike belief and whatever their default, because every human needs we have a belief system, you know what I mean? So my question for you would be how do you approach that with people? Because I think a lot of the people in the spiritual community, they're trying to make progress really quickly, but they seem to pendulum swing. So they end up going super, super excited about this thing, and then they swing to the other side and then swing to the other side and end up with absolutism and all that sort of stuff, and super unbalanced. So how do you help people to prepare for these experiences and to make this experience sustainable for them? So they,
Well, I think Western culture is a culture of addicts, and that's something that's not largely talked about, but there's a heavy addiction aspect to the way Western culture operates, whether it's being addicted to drugs or pornography or power or money or spending or whatever. It's there's always this seeking for mood altering pleasure experience that is at the root of Western culture. So when Western people go into different spiritual practices, that's what they're largely looking for. People are looking for the next high, they want the big, they're chasing the dragon of the ultimate spiritual ecstatic experience. So most of these traditions, whether you're talking about something related to Crowley's AA or the Golden Dawn or traditional Tantra, the initial practices are largely quite tedious and kind of boring. They don't give you that rush, but it's not about that. Most of the initial foundational practices are about tonifying and strengthening the nervous system, right? Which is kind of boring most of the time. If you're just going to sit there and literally do nothing, or like a Vipassana meditation practice, something like that, these types of practices are highly beneficial. They're not necessarily pleasant. They're not necessarily fun, and they're not necessarily that exciting, but it's really about doing the tedious, boring work to get to a point where you can actually strengthen your nervous system, so that when you encounter these really high powered, high octane, ecstatic experiences, whether that's, all of the different methods I already named, but psychedelic, shamanism, sex magic, whatever, like, you can handle it. It's not going to fry your circuits, and that also, I think, comes from experience. But there's training involved. It's like strength training for your nervous system and for your mind and for your consciousness that needs to be undertaken in order to be able to handle these types of experiences. And in shamanic traditions, where there are cultures that have shamanism indigenous to them, like curanderos in the Amazon, they undertake extensive training. For them, it's similar to getting a surgery degree or something like that, where they'll do 4 to 8 years of solitude in the jungle, undertaking really strenuous exercises and purifications and all of these hard things that everybody wants to skip because they're desperately trying to get high, because they're addicted to these head rushy experiences, are really, really important to be able to actually handle and receive value from these experiences that then can be communicated to provide value to others, which is what the archetype of the magician or the shaman has always been about. It's not about having an experience. It's about receiving something of value and of meaning that you can communicate to others to be able to help the world, to help your community, to help your tribe.
Yeah, I completely agree. And yeah, I got another question to expand on that. How would you approach, because what I see happening a lot is that, the real stuff takes time. And like you said, it's a lot of people don't have the willpower or even the desire to commit that kind of time. But not only that, like, they're also up against all this other marketing that promises, healing all your trauma in one session. And, like, all these coaches and, events that are promising the big bangs in a small amount of time. And then what, and some people might get it if they're ready for it, but what happens more than not is either they don't get it and then they label it all as bullshit, or they do get it in a certain way, but it fries their nervous system. And so they label it as bad and evil and, end up probably having to go through more therapy because of it. So it's like, once people experience why it's important, that might help. But, is there a way to, I guess, like, market to people in a way, like, I know marketing sounds bad, but like, how do we get the message across to people that how important it is to actually do to not cut corners? How do you approach that?
I think people really shouldn't trust anybody in our climate when it comes to spiritual development. I think that, we're in a capitalist society that isn't really grounded in any moral values, in which most people are just sort of taking advantage of other people, exploiting people, lying, and it's rampant within the spiritual community. I came to that awareness through experience and through spending years and years in the spiritual community to be completely disillusioned by it. And that disillusionment process has been very beneficial to me. And some people may just have to go through that. They come into it all wide-eyed and naive, and then they realize that it's like, oh, this is just the same as everything else in the world, and it's no different whether you're in a corporate climate or a spiritual climate or whatever. It's just different it's different wrapping on the same box ultimately. And This is, I mean, all the great spiritual teachers are like, don't listen to me. Just, you have to do this for yourself. And I really think that people don't want to take personal responsibility for their spiritual growth and development or for their life. But like, you need to take full responsibility for your life and for your life experience. Like, no one is going to give you the answer.
Yeah.
No one has the quick fix. There might not be a quick fix. Maybe there is, but that's for you to discover for yourself. You know, so I try as much as possible to find reliable sources of information, give those methods a try, but then I always weigh it against my own experience. I'm not going to say something is valuable just because I read it in a book and it said it was valuable. I'm going to do it. I'm going to see how it affects me in my life, and I'm going to decide whether or not that's something I actually feel is valuable.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, but that's the thing. Hey, like, so many people are in a rush, and, you know, especially in like the spiritual, like, business world, and industry, like, people are just reading something or watching something on YouTube, not researching more into it, not experiencing and practicing themselves. It's just copy paste and trying to be the first one to share that information. And yeah, it's just perpetuating more and more of that. And it's tricky, like, to combat, because I feel like the people who are actually doing the work and like doing the things, they're not, you know, one, they're not sharing as much because they're too busy, like, probably, you know, being in their introverted mad scientist mode, magician mode, and trying stuff out. But also they probably don't have a lot of the marketing skills and even some of the charisma and stuff like that other people do, because they've more so focused on that sort of stuff. And like you were saying, that, you know, people who I talk to that have done it for years, like, I've chatted to a couple of guys recently who are like old school chaos magicians. They're both in their 70s now, and they said, like, the older they get, the more they realize they just don't know. Like, it's kind of, and the people who are very sure about things, like, it's like that Dunning-Kruger effect type of situation where, like, a small amount of things, they're so sure, but, you know, I don't know if you've got the same thing, as like, as you go deeper and deeper and deeper into this, you realize that you don't actually know anything. And then magic seems to, as soon as you know something, like, it seems to sneak around the back. I feel like magic works in the gaps. Like, wherever I'm looking, magic isn't there. Like, I can, as soon as I turn my head, like, magic kind of slips behind me, and it's kind of, yeah, it's like mischievous that way.
I mean, it all comes down to the existential angst of the predicament that we find ourselves incarnated into. Like, there are no rules or guidebooks as to how you should live your life. And the terrifying uncertainty and our vulnerability in existence is very anxiety provoking for people. So people are looking for their parent, you know, people are looking for the one that's like, oh, I know, just follow me. And there isn't anybody really who knows, you know what I mean? And so and people look for everything. People look to religion, people look to magic, people look to whatever to try to find their way, to be like, okay, cool, I found it. Now I can just relax. But it doesn't exist, you know? And so if magic works for people, great. You know, if that reduces their suffering in life, because also suffering is inherent in life. And I think that what you're talking about is largely people trying to find escape from reality. You can't escape from reality. Like, this world is a nightmare. I mean, it's also beautiful and it's fantastic, but I mean, there's a lot of, you know, ugly stuff about the world that you're not going to find like an escape from, right? It needs to be reconciled with on its own terms. You need to come to peace with that stuff. And you need to come to peace with the ugly aspects of your experience of life and your personality and your psyche. And, you know, people are ultimately just trying to avoid that because they're afraid of it, because it's, they can't handle it. And, you know, like, I think there's a lot of value in going into that and being able to just kind of be with that.
Yeah. Even Nietzsche, like, talks about, like, how we all, you know, we need suffering of some sort, but, like, the magician's path is like learning what you actually value so much that you want to suffer for, because without the suffering, we don't have like long-term sustainable happiness, because if everything's too easy, we kind of get apathetic and get depressed ultimately. So we need some sort of struggle. Like, we may not want, horrible suffering. But there was like one of the earlier and most influential kind of mystery schools that influenced me was one called the Temple of Set, which I was really grateful to find a lot of their stuff. It was very like grounded logic. But like one of their kind of mantras was struggle and beauty. It's kind of like anything worth having, anything really beautiful is often beautiful because we have to work for it and we have to struggle for it. And I think people's dualistic point of view, and that's what we see. Like, so much you're talking about capitalism and consumerism, and that we're, more and more, like you see in cancel culture and everything, like anything that doesn't, feel good to us immediately, we're just trying to like put off to the side. And it's like trying to shove everything under the blanket to live in this like perfect, like foam room sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like, where do you think it's all? Do you think we're just going to keep pendulum swinging forever, or?
I mean, same as it's always been. I don't think that the condition of humanity and how it relates to life is really any different than any other time in human history. People have always grasped after pleasant experiences and pushed away unpleasant ones. And I think that that's what you see because people can't handle discomfort. I think that the amount of material wealth and privilege that I guess mostly in Western society, like first world countries have, though, has increased that somewhat because people are so coddled that it's very difficult for people to handle, the realities of life. And it also has in some ways decreased empathy because of how disconnected people are from the world. Like, people don't think about the fact that like the laptop they're using was constructed in labor farms with people that are treated like slaves, and the meat that they eat was slaughtered, and like what I don't know, whatever. I mean, like all these sort of like dark truths that are underneath everything, right? That people avoid, that people hide themselves from. Like, I think that people's relationship to happiness actually comes out of the relationship to suffering, right? So the more that people can be like okay with accepting of darkness or that which is ugly or that which is unpleasant, that which is uncomfortable, that allows people to have a greater capacity to be happy. So what you see is people are incredibly unhappy because of their happiness is so fragile, right? Like there are these really specific conditions that people need to meet in order to be happy, which is like to largely avoid anything unpleasant. And like that makes people, I don't want to sound judgy, but it makes people weak. That sense of happiness or fulfillment is much more fragile, therefore. And so I think that there's a lot of strength and actual resiliency and equanimity and peace and happiness that comes into exploring the shadow, that comes into exploring that which is ugly or unpleasant, which is why in Buddhism, for example, there's a lot of that, or in certain forms of Tantra, there's a lot of that, where they would sit and meditate with corpses or whatever, and I mean, being exposed to that which is unpleasant and actually being able to be with it is helpful, and some of the deepest, happiest, most compassionate people I've known have worked in hospice work, have done a lot of work with dying and sick people, and there's something to that. Like that changes people in a certain way that makes them stronger, more dignified by being able to handle reality.
Yeah. And even like our disconnect from death these days as well, that like, most of the time it's closed coffin, or, you don't see the body, and there is a real disconnect. It's like we're trying to, it's like the other things that you mentioned about, like the factory farming and, the factory creation industries and stuff like that. We're just trying to put everything under the rug kind of thing and disconnecting from it. But yeah, we're missing out on all these aspects that make life turn. And without that, and that's the thing, like what we were talking about before, about the struggle needed, like you literally need resistance to build muscle to like, and if you see it from that tantric perspective that we are essentially all of the same being, we're all one being experiencing itself, like it created multiple viewpoints and it created these opposing viewpoints to create resistance, to to grow and to not be bored. If we got, it's like in a dream sometimes as well, I think of like dreaming kind of like being in the void, and it's like you think of something and it happens instantly, but if that was the case all the time, you get really bored. But in here, in physical reality, we have to, when we have an idea, we have to work towards it, and it keeps us motivated. And we also, I think that part of it, we get things we don't necessarily expect, because if we got things instantly, we would never really be surprised. So like, oh, I want that. I go to that. I have that. I want that. And it's constantly moving. But, the fact that you have to get in your car and drive somewhere, or even like catch a plane, or, any of these kind of processes, it leaves room for spontaneity and synchronicity. And like we were talking about before, I feel like magic, synchronicity comes into my life when my life isn't too routinely planned. Like traveling for me is a perfect opportunity for all the weird shit to happen, because like I have a lot of gaps in my life. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a big relationship with synchronicity and novelty. You see it at like Burning Man's like the most synchronistic place in the world, and it's because it's also the most novel. And yeah, definitely, I think that's true.
So what we've kind of like done this in the opposite way. I'd love to know more about how you got into magic and things like that as well, because we kind of covered your experiences and perspective of things, but I'd love to touch on how you ended up into magic, into Tantra, and what you're actually doing with it at the moment as well. Because as I mentioned, I don't actually know much about you, so I'd love to hear how you're weaving that into like your business model and also your art and stuff. I'm really interested as well, because I think magic and art just go hand in hand.
Well, I mean, I got into magic because I was a dramatic kid, because I'm a goth at heart, a romantic, and I was really into dramatic, dark stuff. Like I was super into black metal and these kinds of extreme forms of music when I was a teenager, and a lot of the musicians were into things like Aleister Crowley and into Satanism and stuff. And I actually went to the same high school that Anton LaVey, the founder of Satanism, went to. And so read the Satanic Bible, and then used to hang out in the occult section of the bookstores when I was a teenager, and started reading some of Aleister Crowley's stuff and whatever. And it's kind of an interesting experience. Like I was a really depressed kid. I was super overweight. I was bullied a lot. And I started getting into magic because I was looking for a way to empower myself. I don't know if I was aware of that at the time, but I think that's what I was looking for. And I started meditating because Aleister Crowley said to, and it had an interesting effect where I didn't really expect that. I started to kind of, I guess you could say, heal emotionally as a result of doing that, where I was like largely looking at something to kind of coming from this more egoic perspective of wanting to control life. And as I deepened my meditation practice and I started going to Buddhist meditation groups with my father, who's a psychotherapist, I started finding a lot of peace through that. So I really pursued that primarily as a path, but my interest in magic has always been there. And I was also fascinated with the tarot and all these things and wanted to understand it. When I first started encountering things like the Golden Dawn and the tarot, it was like in the Kabbalah, I wanted to understand it, even though I didn't. And that kind of desire to apprehend these complex subjects led me down really deep rabbit holes of obsession into that. And it's cool to now be able to understand it to a degree. And I kind of see myself in the role of like translator, having taken the time to learn and understand what this stuff is really about, and also participate in actual magical orders, and to have a very disciplined and serious practice around ceremonial magic and chaos magic for many years. And so, yeah, I see myself wanting to share this information because it's empowered me in my life, and it's really helped transform my life. And I believe it can help transform the lives of others. And that also, I think this information should be freely available. I think it should be written and communicated in a way that people can understand, and that we're in a time when we really need this stuff, because we need as many sovereign, self-directed individuals as we can in our world, because the powers that we're up against that want to sort of persuade us to buy into their reality is so strong that it requires these skills that can be learned through things like magic to be able to resist that, and then to be able to create either a new world for yourself and your family and your community, or a new world as a whole. And as an artist as well, I've been inspired a lot by the symbolism and the richness of the mythology of magic and the esoteric. But I also see art as being one of the most integral parts of that, which is, if you're trying to create change in the world, the best way to do that is by creating affecting works of art, whether those are paintings or films or music or comic books that are really high quality, that can really influence people and change their mind to the information that's imparted by the stories that you're telling. So I created or co-created an organization called the Temple of the Eternal Muse, Totem, which is largely an art collective with artists all over the world that are also practicing magicians and seek to use magic in their art to transform the world. And I'm excited to see where that goes, because as Saturn moves into Pisces, I think we have this opportunity to see a renaissance of art and creativity, and to have really valuable, powerful works of art come out of this time. And I think we really need that, because most of the art and the media that people are consuming is corporate sponsored. It's really weighted and on certain ideologies and belief systems that these corporate entities want people to buy into, so that, mostly for their own gain. And I think that we're in a time where we need good art. We need good art that speaks the truth, that really actually helps awaken people and empower people. And so that's largely what I'm doing with my magic. For me, I try to not distinguish magic as either a solely ritual practice or the rest of my life. I try to see the way that I live as being totally informed by magic, by being very conscious of my thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions about myself and reality. But I've, through my years of practice in magic, I've unprioritized just magic is about getting what you want. Like, there's a lot more to life than just your desires and what you want, and using magic to get what you want.
Exactly. And I feel like the true path of the magician is actually creating something new in the world, or creating your own like subjective synthesis and bringing something to it. Because one of my biggest mentors, Michael Kelly, most of his books, like he's known for his occult books, but he actually considers, he also writes fiction, and he considers his fiction books his real like magical works of art, because he says that the ability to actually create something new, like to take like truly what's in his subjective universe and make that objective, and then bring that into other people's consciousness, that's what's really going to have the longer lasting effect. And, any like Aleister Crowley and all these magicians, eventually they, because they realize they're going to die. And so they want to leave something behind. And, stories and art are these things that exist, and, and leave these ripples over time as well. Because I'd love to hear like what you're kind of working on at the moment? Like, what's your main passion? So you've got the collective order at the moment that you're building. What else are you doing?
I just finished a book on magic. That's the first book that I've written, and that was about a year-long process that I was engaged with quite full time. And that's being published by Llewellyn Publishing next year, and amazing, so that's exciting. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of like, for now, at this early stage of my life, I turned 30 like next week, so I'm still young, but that's kind of like my swan song of my esoteric practice and exploration up until this point, of all the tools I've ever used.
Because totally. you just came out of your Saturn return, I saw as well. I just yesterday, when Saturn moved into Pisces, technically is the end of my Saturn return, although it will, I think, retrograde back into Aquarius for a little bit at certain times. But so I mean, I'm mostly just working on, I just finished that book. That was a huge project. I'm working on my own personal art, paintings, and some new courses. I'm organizing another retreat. I did my first retreat last year in December, and I'm organizing another one in a castle in Europe this year in October. That'll be awesome, and definitely recommend that to anybody that wants a truly special experience. And that's pretty much what I've been working on. And then always just working on myself. I'm my main project, and my life, and trying to be a more, I'll say, trying to be a less harmful force in the world. I think people are largely harmful forces. And so the path of self-development is like becoming a less and less harmful entity in the world, but hopefully to be something positive towards myself. And towards what is
others.
that for you? Because everyone's, I guess, got different values and different interpretations of what that might mean. So what is being a less harmful person in your perspective mean?
Living a life that's grounded in love and integrity, and to help as much as possible to empathize with the experiences of others, and to consider them, and to try to reduce suffering in others' lives as much as possible. That doesn't mean being nice to people all the time, but to at least have the intention to have other people's best interest at heart, and to have the best interest not only of people but the whole web of life and the world.
Yeah, I like that. And there's lots more I want to touch on, but just because we're getting close to the hour, I did want to dive a little bit more before the end into, do you know the terms like kind of like white, like light fluff and dark fluff kind of thing? Like there's, like you said, you like the darker aesthetic, and yeah, I find that as well. And I feel like people don't ask questions in like, what does it mean? That I think this thing is evil or bad. What does that even mean? A lot of the time it's just because it's got a dark aesthetic of it, right? They think of the angels as good and demons as bad. Whereas like, if you look at the grimoires, like there's angels of death, but then there's, I've summoned, demons to find my car keys or to like do healing stuff. And how are you? And especially because I feel like this is very relevant recently for you, because you were, I don't know if that's your usual go-to to have that kind of like darker aesthetic with your marketing. But with the Black Tantra especially, like I'd love to hear what even is that you're working on with the Black Tantra, but also from a perspective of someone who's trying to share stuff. Because I find that as well, especially in the yoga world, there's a lot of like love and lighters, which I love and light. But the fact that I talk about magic or some other aspects, like I've had people, I don't know, who are not as informed in these practices, just think that I'm doing crazy evil shit because they don't even know what any of this stuff is.
Well, the world is kind of backwards, where you get a lot of the times the people that position themselves as being the most light and love are actually the predators that do the most harm. And then, you see that a lot in the church and whatever. And then you have a lot of people that are some of the sweetest, most pure-hearted people I've ever met that come across as aesthetically dark, and this has just been my experience. So in a way, it's a statement of that. And it's also a statement to filter people out as like a test to see like who can pass and then who can step through the threshold to be in my world. Because if people are that superficial, then they're not a good candidate for a relationship in my life. But yeah, and I mean, it started out as a joke, and Black Tantra is not really a thing in the sense of it's not like that's a real tradition. But what I'm referring to when I say Black Tantra is this is largely focused around your own desires and like your sovereign autonomy and what you want to do with this practice. This is for power, like it's not like Tantra, like, oh, we're healing our chakras. That's not what this is, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it and make it seem like that's what this is. This is for people that want to change circumstances in their life, that want to have more power to create the life that they want for themselves or the circumstances that they want for themselves, and for whatever reason, I guess due to Christian programming, that's seen as dark, which I don't consider that dark necessarily, because I think we all want the same things.
Yeah.
And people too often keep themselves stuck in suffering because of their conditioning and programming around what is apparently good and bad in terms of going after their own desires.
Yeah.
But I want to see the people that would participate in this course actually become happier people as a result of it,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I agree. And that was kind of the first explanation that I found of left-hand path / right-hand path, or like black magic versus white magic. Like black magic as it's just self-sovereignty. Like you're seeing, it's like you were talking about earlier that, some people find out, just say, and I'm not saying it's the truth, it's kind of my truth in a way, but like, let's just say the universe has no inherent meaning. It's a sandbox, right? Some people would find that completely liberating and freeing and the most beautiful thing, because like there is no meaning, so we can create our own. But on the flip side, a lot of people would find that as the most horrible, existentially destroying thing ever, because, if everything has no meaning, but like, it's like everything and nothing. There's like, if it has no meaning, if everything has no meaning, then everything has meaning. Every single action we do is important, because that is literally the only thing that is happening. We are all influencing this big mysterious goo that we're all a part of. And so, yeah, and I think that's the thing, like we all want to be told what to do, because not only does it give us more conviction and permission to do it, but if it doesn't go well, it's not our fault. Like we can blame, someone else. We can blame our deity, like Sky Daddy kind of thing, or blame our teachers, or blame that. So, I mean, I'm in full support of more self-sovereignty, and that's kind of what I'm doing as well. But man, I got to admit, from my own experience, like it's, how's that going like so far? Because I feel like, I mean, I want to believe that it is for the masses, that self-sovereignty is for like everyone. But in my experience, like it's, that hasn't been the case. More so than not, people freak out at true self-sovereignty. And end up projecting it. So yeah, how's it all going?
Socially, groups always organize into hierarchies. I think it's part of human nature. And so you do have leaders that are willing to take more responsibility for the rest of the people that then follow them, right? And there's certain individuals that are willing to take that responsibility on, and others that aren't. And it's hard to say what creates the conditions that would put somebody in that place or not. Like for me, I don't do well as a follower. I kind of need to be in that leadership position, or at least in a collaborative position to feel myself. But other people are more naturally inclined towards being in that kind of follower position because they're afraid to take full responsibility for themselves and for others. Right. Because when you're in that position, like I'm aware that I take a lot of responsibility on by teaching this stuff, by sharing this information. I take that seriously. I don't want to have any harm come to anybody that might participate in any course or retreat or whatever that I do. You know, I care for the people that are participating. And so that's part of being a leader, right? It's taking responsibility for others, but I'm willing to take that responsibility.
Yeah, I really like that, man. And yeah, I love that you talked about hierarchy because I feel like a lot of people have resistance to even the word hierarchy these days, but I think it is such an inherent thing. You know, we see it in naturally occurring in civilization and tribalism, but also our mythology. Like every mythology has like hierarchy and they have their different archetypal ideas. I don't know if you've ever read George Dumazil, but he like splits it into three main sections. So you've got like the kind of like the head, like the kind of like king warrior, magician king type of archetype, which is the delegating and organizing kind of like Tyr or Odin. And then you've got the military, which basically protects and sustains like the order of things and like expands the possibility in the arena where you can do that in. And then you've got kind of everything else, which is like the workers, the artists and all that sort of stuff. But it's not like a hierarchy as in one is less important than the others. Like they all interrelate. There's just less at the top because, you know, you can't have thousands of people delegating all the time. It's just going to be confusing. So you have less people at the top and then more. Does that make sense? Are you familiar with that kind of idea?
Yeah, you see that a lot in different mythologies and spiritual systems. Even, you know, within the Western canon, you have like the monad, then you have different gods, and then you have different archangels, and then there's angels beneath those, choirs of angels, and then there's spirits and whatever. So yeah, I think that hives operate in that way. You see it in nature, and I think human beings operate in that way as well. You know, and communities sort of elect their leaders, or leaders are self-elected. It's hard to say, but it occurs in human communities as well.
Yeah, cool. Well, bro, there's actually so much more I want to chat to you about, but might do a part 2 because that way we can lead into that. And because so in the second one, I'd love to get more into what actual like you mentioned that you're a part of some magical orders. If you're happy to talk about that, I'd love to delve into and even just some of the history of what actual practices, what authors, what schools of thought, what pantheons and stuff like that really influence you and what you practice. Because there's so much more I want to delve into. But as we just kind of like tail end this one, did you want to drop any other little last pieces into what everything we talked about, summarize, or what you're doing at the moment that people can get involved with?
Well, you can follow me on Instagram, and it's where I will be launching all of my offerings. But if you're interested, I'm organizing this retreat in October. It's going to be a very limited space for people, but I think it's going to be amazing. And
so it's in a castle in Europe?
It's going to be in a castle in Europe. Yeah.
What castle have you already?
The specific castle to be decided, but we have several castles. There's a lot of castles available. When you start to look for it, you're like, man, there's a hell of a lot of castles available for rent. Yeah. But maybe long-term vision would be to do a sort of Hogwarts thing and have the castle be like a school that would be, you know, a business that could sustain itself and people could live there, and that would be fucking awesome. But that's a longer-term vision.
I would definitely be down for that.
I think a lot of people would be, and I think it should happen, and I want to help make that happen somehow. So there's that, and then I'm starting this Sex Devil course, which is the mysteries of Black Tantra. But really, it's just like a, sort of grimoire, sex magic, evocation type course. This is going to start in May, so if you're interested in that, get a hold of me. And then I have my Magic 101 course, which is really just the foundational course that's extremely thorough. Involves guest instruction from people like Mitch Horowitz and Lon Milo Duquette and David Schumacher and Carl Abrahamson, these really phenomenally articulate magicians who have written tons of books. And I think the course is amazing. So I really hope people get into that. I've got like a tarot course also, and I do one-on-one coaching and yada, yada, yada. I've got a lot of online offerings. I got a book coming out. Yeah, just follow me on Instagram, send me a DM. We can talk about all these things. And yeah, man, thanks for having me on here today.
Yeah, no, thank you for, especially like such short notice being down for it, man. I really appreciate it. And yeah, looking forward to part 2 and delving more into the specifics of your practices. Thank you for listening and being a part of this episode of Make Yoga Magic Again, the House of Mages podcast. I've been your host, Daniel Erulian Cuming. Massive thanks to Jake Kobrin for being my guest on this episode. As per usual, you can find all the information about Jake and more of what we do here at the House of Mages in the show notes below. Thank you again. I will speak to you soon. And until then, make yoga magic again.